Welcome, everyone. My name is Callie Hoyt. I am the Director of Federal Government Relations for the National Marine Manufacturers Association. We're delighted that you're joining us for today's webinar on the future of marine propulsion technologies. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes to go over. If you have any technical issues using the platform or any audio problems, please use the chat box and we will respond right away. Please note everyone's lines have been automatically muted today, but we do want the session to be as interactive as possible. So we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please type your questions into the Q&A box below and hit send to submit them. At the end of the presentation, we'll answer as many questions as possible in the remaining time. The session will be recorded and everyone will receive a thank you email with the on-demand materials in a few days. With that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Mr. Jeff Wassel. He's the Engineering Manager, Environmental Compliance and Regulatory Development with Bombardier Recreational Products.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to present today. So it's a really interesting time in the regulatory world at the moment. As a marine industry, we're currently balancing the electrification efforts of the automotive industry, the push for lower hydrocarbon and NOx emission reductions, greenhouse gas, climate change, political motivations, all the while facing experiencing some of the largest growth we've experienced as an industry, certainly in the last decade. In the context of potential new exhaust emission regulations, there are a number of states, cities, and countries that have announced bans on internal combustion engines and cars. California, New Jersey, Massachusetts, as well as a number of international cities. Just got back from Europe last week, and there was a ban that was announced for all of the canals within Amsterdam to have any combustion-powered boats running in those canals. So we also have some challenges ahead with our changing climate, certainly from fires, extreme droughts, more frequent devastating storms. We have a lot of challenges that are ahead of us with our changing climate. So the marine industry needs to do its part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're absolutely in a transition phase at this point, and we need to work together as an industry to drive meaningful and achievable policy actions. The last thing we want is to have a complete ban of recreational boating, or perhaps even regulatory policies that don't necessarily align with reality. So the goals of the presentation are as follows. Number one, we're going to recognize the challenges that are unique to our industry and differentiate from what's happening in the automotive industry. Number two, we're going to explore marine electrification and gain a better understanding of where electrification makes sense. We'll take a look at what role low carbon liquid fuels could play in our ability to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, we'll conclude with some thoughts on where to go from here. So we're certainly starting to see a lot more examples of electric and even hybrid boats on the market. And by no means should we discount the role and the importance that electrification will play in our industry moving forward. It's wildly important. But there are some challenges that are unique to our industry that need to be recognized and appropriately discussed. The marine industry is going to continue to rely on liquid fuels for quite some time. And this is really driven by two things. Number one is the very slow retirement rate of boats. 12 million registered power boats in the United States. Of that, we're selling on about just under 2% annual retirement rate. So it's going to take a long time to turn this fleet over. Number two, the second issue is really with respect to energy density. If you take a look, and I'll use Tesla as an example here, they've got a long range model, 348-mile range, looks like a car, drives like a car. The acceleration is second to none. It's incredible if you haven't driven one. But a lot of people don't realize that same vehicle, if it were operating according to the way that a boat operates, the Icomia duty cycle, it would only have about a 33-mile range. And that's because it takes over 10 times the energy to move a recreational boat through the water compared to a car. Now we're talking, just to be clear, we're talking about boats that are planing. We're not talking about displacement hulls. We're talking about planing boats. So a lot of what you're seeing in terms of policy right now is related to the ability for electric vehicles to reduce CO2 emissions over their lifetime. So if you take a look at this graph here, you'll see that the initial production of the battery electric vehicle results in about 50% more CO2 emissions than the internal combustion powered vehicle. However, at the end of its useful life, which is 150,000 miles, you'll see that emissions of CO2 have been reduced by about 40%. You reach a break-even point just over 2 years of operation. And that's what the majority of studies are showing. They're showing that we have positive CO2 reductions with battery electric vehicles occurring within about 1 to 3 years of operation relative to internal combustion engines. And the battery electric vehicle lifetime CO2 emissions are reduced by 40 and 70%. So that's why you'll see such a big push here toward electrification for the automotive industry. So the solution is clear, right? I mean, we need to ban all combustion powered boats and move completely to electric. I get folks all the time that say, hey, Jeff, why are you continuing to work on internal combustion engines in addition to electrical development? Just put a battery pack in it and electric motor and you'll be done. Well, there's certainly some challenges to that. And I just want to explain this. I want to come back to this slide because this is really important. If you look at what's happening with battery electric vehicles, everything is amortized over a period of 150,000 miles of operation. Typical recreational boat, according to the EPA, is used, it's 350 hours, roughly 35 hours a year. It's got a 10-year useful life. That's, so these are very different fundamental things. And in order to answer this question, how effective is battery electric propulsion in reducing CO2 emissions from the marine sector, I needed to create a model. And for inputs, I'm looking at the amount of CO2 to produce a battery, the CO2 from the generation of electric, the future electric grid, a number of things, battery density, future battery density, the types of craft, and the rest go into this model. And the output from the model is the break-even point in hours by horsepower, where CO2 emissions from gasoline is equal to that of electric. Now, probably wondering why there is a picture of former President US Jimmy Carter in my presentation. I'll get to that in a moment. There's an important reason for this. I'll skip that for now. So let's take a look at the model for a 20 horsepower electric motor, okay? You're going to operate that for a period of 3.25 hours. So this is really your range. So according to the duty cycle, you're going to have about just over 3 hours of range. There's some science behind this number, which I won't get into right at the moment because we don't have enough time. But this calculates out to about a 10 kilowatt hour battery pack, and you're going to operate it 35 hours a year or over 350 hours over a 10-year period. So let's take a look here. So the initial first year of operation, that electric motor and battery is going to result in about 11% more CO2. But by the time you reach the 10-year end of useful life, you've reduced CO2 emissions by about 32%. You break even over a period of 3 years. So this is pretty reasonable. You take a look at this. This is very, very plausible in terms of its ability to reduce CO2 emissions. Let's take a look at a 150 horsepower motor. Same thing, we're going to have just over 3 hours of actual operation according to the IBEX duty cycle. So we require a 75 kilowatt hour battery, and we're going to operate at 35 hours a year. Now, in this particular example, you'll see that because of the energy intensive process of producing the battery, your year one operation of this particular vessel is going to reduce, or it's going to increase CO2 emissions by about 250%. You'll reach a break-even point at 9 years, and you'll have the ability of reducing emissions by about 10% at the end of that 10-year period. Now, a lot of people say, hey, Jeff, 35 hours a year is not a lot. I'm going to spend $1 gazillion on this electric boat. I'm going to use it more than that. So let's say 60 hours per year. Now here you'll start to see the situation gets a little bit better now. So your initial year one, you're going to increase CO2 emissions by about 181%. You'll reach a break-even point of 5 years of operation, and by the time you're done, you'll reduce emissions by about 35%. So let's take a look at one more scenario here. Let's suppose for a minute that you have a lake that has a supercharging station. And you're willing to sacrifice the range in order to have a smaller battery. Okay, so instead of 3 hours, you have 1.5 hours of operation. This brings your battery size down to 35 kilowatts. You're going to operate 60 hours a year. Here you'll see that your amount of CO2 after year one is only about 50% higher. You break even in 2 years, and you reduce your CO2 emissions by about 60%. Now, this is closer to what you're seeing in what's happening in automotive. However, there's a fundamental flaw in this assumption, and that has to do with the charging cycles of the battery. A typical lithium ion battery only has about 300 to 500 cycles. This is going from, nearly fully discharged to fully charged before you reach a degradation in battery state of health. And with this example, you're bumping up right along that 500 cycles. So back to the Tesla example again, you had 150,000 miles, 348-mile range. Over the course of that 150,000 miles, you're going to have worst case 431 cycles. So that's really where it gets a little bit tricky with boats. Now, how do you get around this? Well, really, fundamentally, you would need to use a larger battery, but the challenge is the battery weight. Certainly, I don't think we have any issues with electric motors in terms of their ability to propel boats, but the challenge is always related to the battery, and that's what everyone in the world is working on right now, trying to reduce the weights of batteries. It's not as big of an issue in automotive because of rolling mass, but here's a perfect example. 6 pounds is the weight of a 1 gallon of gasoline. Of course, you can't use all the energy in a gallon of gas. So the equivalent amount of energy is about 152 pounds of batteries. So you can see how quickly a typical 30-gallon gas tank would weigh about 4,500 pounds. That would reduce your person's capacity and flotation and the rest of the boat. So that's really fundamentally one of the challenges that we're dealing with, is trying to plane that boat. So we'll wrap up here in a second. So let's take a look at the model. So let's summarize for a second. If you had a 200 horsepower electric boat operating 35 hours per year, at the end of year 5, you would create about 60% more CO2 than an internal combustion engine. At the end of year 10, which is the graph on the right, you would reduce CO2 emissions by about 5%. Now you can really start to see how the hours of operation is really critical in understanding the CO2 reduction potential. And you can see as you go smaller engines, it's also a lot easier to achieve positive CO2 reductions with electrification. So now it's very easily we can obtain a 30% reduction in net CO2 emissions by using an advanced biofuel. And a lot of folks say, hey, Jeff, biofuels are not sustainable. They tear up the land, they divert food crops. And I would tend to agree with those folks in the context of a 146 billion gallon gasoline market. We're producing about 16 billion gallons of ethanol in the United States. It's just not simply enough. We just don't have enough biofuel to really make a meaningful difference. And that's why you're seeing electrification gaining popularity. Well, guess what? Recreational marine only counts for about 665 million gallons, which is, by the way, 0.5% of the gasoline consumption in the United States. So we have an opportunity here. There's really two industries that can benefit significantly from liquid fuels or e-fuels. Aviation is one of them. They're pushing hard for that. You see a lot of work with sustainable jet fuels. We've pioneered a lot of work as an industry on biobutanol, helping bringing a next generation biofuel to the consumers, and it could address a lot of the existing products that are out there. So in summary, the life cycle carbon emissions of propulsion systems are highly influenced by the hours of operation and power output level of the vessel. So if you're going to buy a boat and you never use it, then certainly, the emissions or CO2 emissions are going to be much lower than if you were to produce that battery electric boat and not use it. Lower horsepower marine engines could more easily justify electrification from a CO2 reduction standpoint, even with low operating hours. We need to have careful understanding of the application and the annual hours of use for electric boats need to be considered. So it's not just a blanket statement. You've got to really fundamentally understand, how many hours you're going to put on the boat and how you're going to use that. Low carbon liquid fuels still have a significant potential to reduce carbon emissions in the marine sector, both for the existing fleet, the 12 million boats that are out there today, you can have an impact right away, and for the new fleet that we're working on. So really what we want to do in terms of next steps is to aggressively pursue a balanced approach. So diversified energy sources and technology. We want to continue to invest in electrification, hugely important for our industry. We have to find ways of getting electrification and products to consumers. We want to invest in hybrid electric technologies. These are products that will enable the customers to have the range that they need, to reduce the battery size, which is so important for weight. I talked about biofuels and sustainable liquid fuels, e-fuels, very, very important for a lot of those products that are not going to be easily electrified. And I can't understate the importance of advanced hull design. As an industry, for years and years, we've simply improved the performance of a boat by throwing more and more horsepower at it. It's an easy way. You just, instead of one outboard, you put two outboard engines on it. Advanced hull design, easy planing hulls is really key. And, we can talk about hydrofoils and foiling devices, and there's a lot of things out there that can help improve this, but that's going to be critical as we start to increase the number of boats that are utilizing electrification. So one last thing, why was former President Jimmy Carter in my presentation? During the oil embargo of the late 70s, the Carter administration banned all weekend boating. I can't say how devastating that was to our industry. They banned it not because boats were unnecessarily consuming too much fuel. It was because of the perception that boats were consuming too much fuel. And that's the issue that we face as an industry today, is really perception. As the automotive industry is pushing really hard to move toward electrification, everyone else is, got this electrification on their minds, investors and the rest. We have to be careful that we transition in an appropriate way so that we don't end up with a ban on our products out in the marketplace. So one last slide, just as a factoid, recreational marine accounts for 0.7% of transportation in terms of CO2 and 0.3% of overall CO2 sources in the United States. Not that that gives us a free pass, but it puts it into context of our contribution as an industry. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat. I'll pass it on to Daniel for the next for his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. My name is Daniel Vielhaber. I work at Nationwide Economics. I'm an economist in that group. I'm here to talk about the market for electric vehicles. First, I'm going to start with an economic overview. The recession risks are up, but recession indicators suggest that recession isn't imminent. The ones that we like to look at are the index for leading economic indicators, the yield curve between the 3-month and the 10-year treasuries. These tend to go negative and stay negative for 6 to 12 months prior to a recession, and that's not what we're seeing. would suggest that a recession is very unlikely before the end of the year. We don't currently have one in our economic forecast before the end of 2023. One caveat with that forecast is that it was done at the beginning of June, and a lifetime has passed since. It's been 3 weeks since that forecast was done. I have said for a few months now that if you're asking my personal opinion, I believe that a recession will be here before the end of 2023. And based on the data that's come out over the last few weeks, I would actually push that up and say it wouldn't surprise me more toward the middle of 2023, maybe sometime in the third quarter. This business cycle, the sections in here do not indicate time. You can be in any one of these sections for any indefinite amount of time, but you can't go back. So once you're in a section, you can only go forward. You can only go clockwise. So we are officially late cycle, the part of the cycle where rates are rising, and the next step is a recession. It is possible to skip over the recession and get to the part where job growth picks back up again. That is what we would call the Fed engineering a soft landing. That is very rare, and it has never happened when the problem in the economy is on the supply side. So I'm not saying with 100% certainty that it won't happen, but I am saying that I wouldn't bet on it, at least not unless you got really, really good odds. I would guess that we will get a recession from aggressive stance against inflation from the Fed. So with recession risks elevated and rising as we go forward, with rising risks, rising interest rates, it's important to note that a recession will limit sales in most industries due to decreased demand, but the auto industry might not actually feel the effects of that simply because they are severely limited on the supply side right now. You could cut demand by quite a bit at this point, and sales wouldn't really change just because there isn't the supply to service the demand as it is right now. So this is an illustration of how we see slowing growth affecting the labor market, which is very important for auto sales. Our base forecast has unemployment hovering near historic lows for the next couple of years before rising to and above 4%, which is still very low. Once again, I personally believe that this is maybe a little optimistic. I wouldn't be surprised if we were closer to maybe 4.5% or so by the end of 2024. But conditions should still be fine for auto sales, particularly when you consider that there is a lot of pent-up demand from the last couple of years from people who wanted to buy cars but were unable to simply because the supply wasn't there. So our sources in the auto industry tell us that current demand would support annual sales of about 17 million units, or roughly 3 million units above what we saw in the first quarter. That's if the supply were there to service that demand. So the major problem is the lack of semiconductor microchips, which has been in the news for better part of a year and a half now. Electric vehicles need much more of these per unit than internal combustion vehicles. So there is a supply problem with regard to electric vehicles, which is important context when you consider that electric vehicles set a record for sales in the first quarter. 200,000 EVs were sold in Q1. That still represents a small portion of overall sales, but it nonetheless shows growth during a time when overall sales were well down from what we've seen even recently. Oh, didn't need to skip. Auto Pacific is forecasting EV sales of 1 million units in 2024 and 2 million in 2026. given current sales, these numbers don't seem outlandish, but growth and demand is likely to slow without more options on the supply side and infrastructure improvements. And so of those two issues, I'll start with the options. Nearly 80% of all light auto sales come from light trucks, but electric light truck options are very new and very limited, and affordability reduces those options further. So unless you have $100,000 to spend on a vehicle, the GMC Hummer EV might not be for you. More options are going to arrive within the next couple of years, including new options from Chevy, GMC, Tesla, and Toyota. So there will be some new options, some more competition, which is going to bring some more affordable options and some more less affordable options. Another segment of consumers that is left out of the market is the medium to large family. And I can give a personal anecdote on this. I have 4 children. The youngest was born a year ago last week. And a year ago, maybe today, I was sitting on the couch with my wife, who noted that it was awfully convenient that she drove a vehicle which could hold all 4 of our children, and I did not. Now, after my required and indignant response initially, I thought about it and realized that she was right, that it was awfully convenient. And a couple days later, I had a vehicle which could hold all 4 of our children. One thing I didn't consider during that brief car search was an electric vehicle. Right now, there are 0 fully electric minivans, and there are also 0 in the plans that I'm aware of. There are very few 7-seat SUV options. There are some in the concept stage, so there will be a few more within the next few years, although affordability is an issue there as well. So all of this is to say that that the market is moving toward servicing the demand of a broader swath of consumers, but there are still, at least for the foreseeable future, be some segments of the population which are left out of the market. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention oil prices likely having an impact of pushing prospective car buyers to considering EVs. The cost per mile for an EV is currently less than half that of the cost per mile for internal combustion vehicles. And oil prices are expected to remain high going forward. They should come down some, particularly as Saudi Arabia did just announce that they are going to increase production. So range anxiety factor is the other side of this cost coin. That is, to put into other words, sure, I have to pay more, but there are gas stations everywhere and filling up is easy.
Way to see it.
So infrastructure improvements and battery technology improvements are needed to assuage these concerns. Battery tech has improved immensely and will continue to improve over time due in part to competition, but where will the investment in infrastructure come from? Today, most charging takes place at home. That's roughly 90%, but not everyone has a garage. And what about long trips? Retailers and restaurants such as McDonald's, Walmart, and Whole Foods have already started installing chargers, and plenty of others are planning on it. And don't overlook the conversion of, at least a partial conversion of gas stations. As gas companies stand to lose a lot of business over the next several years if they don't adapt. An example of this down in Texas, a place called Buc-ee's, kind of a combination retailer and gas station, has started to install Tesla fast chargers at their locations. And earlier this year, Shell launched a charging hub in London. And more of this should be expected as the market share for EVs increases. Maybe most importantly, car manufacturers are currently investing hundreds of millions of dollars to build up EV charging infrastructure. And it seems unlikely that consumer preferences and investor preferences would shift toward EVs without firms filling the accompanying shift in energy demand. They want to sell these products. They want to make a profit off of them. To the extent that improving the infrastructure is cost effective, they're going to do that. So I'd expect to see a lot more charging stations within the next 5 years. The goal timeline that the manufacturers have for their investments is by the end of 2024. And that's all I have today. I will now turn it over to Scott Berry.
All right, figure out how to unmute myself. Thank you, sir. As Daniel said, my name is Scott Berry with the NMMA. And today I'm going to talk about the electric propulsion system standards, as well as lithium ion battery standards that impact the marine products. So next slide. I'm going to kick things off with the ABYC voluntary standards, beginning with ABYC E30 electric propulsion systems. This standard addresses the design, construction, and installation of AC and DC electrical systems on boats for the purpose of propulsion. And it applies to AC systems on boats operating at line-to-line voltages more than 300 volts, but less than 1,000 volts, as well as DC systems operating at 60 volts nominal, but less than 1,000 volts, including battery banks, motors, and controllers for the purpose of propulsion. Now, the E30 standard discusses electrical wiring best practices, environmental design, temperature considerations, emergency stop requirements, monitoring systems, owner's manual information, and safety label requirements. Now, typically we'll see these electric propulsion systems powered by lithium ion batteries, and ABYC recently published a brand new E13 lithium ion batteries. Now, some of the details within the standard may look familiar. That's because this used to be a technical information report titled TE13. This standard addresses the selection and installation of lithium-ion batteries on boats, lithium-ion battery systems design, and manufacturer safety information. It applies to install boat battery systems over 600 watts. In addition, it touches on topics such as battery testing requirements, battery system design, including BMS battery management systems, shock and vibration, charging sources, switches, ignition protection, and several other key details around this topic. Now, standards have implementation dates. For E30, we're looking at an implementation or compliance date of July 31st, 2022, in about 10 days. And the E13 standard will have an implementation date of July 31st, 2023, about a year from now. Now, if you'd like more information on these standards or would like to read through them yourselves, they're available for purchase through the ABYC website at abycinc.org. So those were the domestic standards covering electric propulsion and lithium ion. Now I'd like to touch on another segment, a large segment for the US manufactured shipping product, and that's into the EU. So there are two standards currently under review, ISO 16315 and ISO 23625. These two standards have scopes that look closely or similar to the ABYC scopes, and that's not by accident. The US has multiple representatives that sit on these working groups, and we do our best to work and harmonize these standards so we can build consistency across the industry for the manufacturers. In addition to the ISO and ABYC standards, there's additional work going on. One point I'd like to make is the ISO 8665 Part 2. This standard is electric propulsion power rating standard, again, to promote consistency across the industry. So we looked at the voluntary standards of the US as well as ISO. You might be asking, where does the Coast Guard stand in all of this? So the Coast Guard has actually written a policy on electrification of vessels. That policy has been submitted and it's waiting for approval. Once that policy is approved, it will be published to the safeafloat.com website. I've got a snapshot here on this slide on the right-hand side. Under the Boat Builders Toolkit, you'll find those policies that are already posted, which include boat testing procedures for outboard boats greater than 2 horsepower and vessels powered by personal watercraft. So be on the lookout for a notification from the Coast Guard or the NMMA on when this electrification policy is published. That's my quick review of the standards that impact electric propulsion, as well as the lithium battery installations. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'll pass things over to the person responsible for putting this webinar together, Callie Hoyt. Thanks, Callie.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, and again, everyone. Callie Hoyt. I work out of the NMMA's Washington, D.C. advocacy office. As we've heard today, the industry has just made leaps and bounds in really driving next generation propulsion technologies forward. But incentives and investments at the federal and state level are going to be required to be able to realize further development and broader adoption, while also making sure that we're facilitating a market-driven transition to these types of technologies. And that's where advocacy comes in. And advocacy is going to continue to be an integral component towards helping the industry to continue to drive this innovation forward. So with that, I'm going to walk you through an update on some policy initiatives that NMMA actively has underway to help advance the industry's priorities. So first, I'm going to talk about the American Boating Congress. This is the marine industry's premier advocacy event of the year. Last month, NMMA welcomed over 200 industry stakeholders to Washington, D.C. To drive the industry's policy priorities forward. And for the first time, next generation marine propulsion was front and center in those discussions. With industries and policymakers at every level of government exploring solutions to continue curbing greenhouse gas emissions, ABC really represents a prime opportunity to be educating lawmakers, the administration, and their staff on these significant advancements that the industry has made in a really short amount of time towards developing these new emerging propulsion system technologies, while also making significant headway towards identifying where a lot of the big challenges are that you heard from Jeff earlier, and where technology is going to need to go in order to see broader adoption across all types of voting types and use cases. Now, while these initiatives come with their own unique set of challenges and will certainly not arrive overnight, nor look entirely the same as electrification in other industries like the auto industry, which the general public and lawmakers are much more familiar with, it's really critical that we as an industry remain at the forefront in these conversations to make sure that we are playing an active role in shaping what the future of voting will look like. And at ABC this year, we really laid the groundwork in both highlighting the innovation that's coming out of our industry and also beginning really important key conversations that we will continue to build off as we continue to advance the industry's next generation priorities. So some of the things that we had at ABC to really be highlighting these innovations are first the product showcase. At the wharf in DC, we brought a number of electric boats and other conservation-focused emerging technologies. And for a product showcase, we took members of the administration and officials from leading recreation management agencies out for a ride on electric boats. And I think for all of them, it was their first time getting out on the water in an electric boat. And I think for those folks that are actively involved in figuring out charging network and how to use a lot of funding that was just made available last year towards building out electric corridors across the country, electrifying the nation's federal fleet of boats. And so giving them that first hands-on experience went a long way. Next, we had a panel discussion on the political and practical realities of next generation marine propulsion. It was a really substantive cross-industry discussion with executives from Torqeedo, Brunswick, Yamaha, Ingenuity, as well as General Motors. And the conversation really kind of covered the full every issue, many that we've already talked about today of, what are some of the existing opportunities with electrification, and that, the industry is really just starting to kind of scratch the surface with EVs. As Jeff mentioned, we have 12 million gas-powered boats that are being in use today, and we need to be able to secure a carbon neutral liquid biofuel to really help further reduce the emissions from the existing fleet that we have out there, and that the industry will continue to sell for the foreseeable future. We also had a discussion about tech neutrality. Electrification is more likely than not going to be the only solution for all types of boating applications. And that's why it's so important for the industry, as we're starting to advance our next generation propulsion initiatives, making sure that we're maintaining a tech neutral approach and exploring all of the different types of renewable powered opportunities that will help accomplish our goals towards minimizing and reducing the emissions and carbon footprint. We also had a great conversation because we had General Motors on the panel about what are some of the similarities as well as the different variables between electrification on the road versus on the water. Looking at the market demand. I think with EV sales continuing to increase on the roadway, a lot of consumers are becoming much more familiarized with electric technologies, but they still expect these electric products to be able to provide that same performance and experience as their internal combustion engine counterparts. And whereas that's much more easy to accomplish on the road, just the fact that water is about 800 times more dense than air, it takes a lot more energy density to move a boat through the water than it does the car through the air. In addition to that, we also talked about just around the challenges, the cost parity issue. Now, eventually, as product technology advances further, prices will start to come down as these products come to scale. But until then, an electric propulsion systems, starting point just for the lower horsepower models are at least 2 times the price of the gas powered counterpart. So, while we're waiting for these products and battery technology to come to scale and to see those costs come down, we had a conversation of how do we make sure that we can keep the industry in boating affordable for everyone that wants to get out on the water. We also covered infrastructure, which we've heard a little bit about today. I think there's a big misconception that it will be easy to just flip the switch and have boats, turn over completely to electric because so many marinas have built-in shore power. However, the issue is that it's really unknown whether the existing grid is large enough to be able to support a full turnover from gas to electric propulsion. And so as a part of that and really figuring out what are the ins and outs and what are the needs to be able to support those charging needs for a larger electric boat fleet. Also looking at, what is it going to take for private boating access as well as public boating access, and starting to have conversations with the federal land and water management agencies that are now actively looking at, how to make strategic decisions about where to start building out these first, charging networks for recreation products. Lastly, we also talked about just competing for materials. There's a major effort right now, as we heard from Daniel, about trying to onshore mineral mining and as well as processing to help bring the cost down and to spur more domestic manufacturing. But just given the fact that the marine industry, the volumes are so much smaller than the auto industry, we're going to be challenged in terms of being able to compete for those materials and minerals once they are eventually brought onshore. And so that's something that we as an industry are going to continue to have to work through. But really, I think the biggest takeaway from the panel was that how important it is for our industry to be. I think there's a lot of unknown and answers that we need to figure out, and solutions and identify them, and how we need to be engaging with federal and state partners. But at the end of the day, we need to be having those conversations now, making sure that we're educating them on where the technology is, where it needs to go, because we need to make sure that we are managing these expectations and putting in place a realistic timeline for electric and other next generation propulsion products. In addition to the panel and the showcase, we also had, Scott and I took 2 groups of NMMA members up to the Hill. We had over a dozen meetings on Capitol Hill with members of Congress and congressional committees that are very closely engaged and influential in shaping EV policy. A lot of them had not even thought about electrification for recreational products, let alone out on the water. And so a lot of these conversations, we're just introducing them to that concept of next gen, and what does it look like now, and what is the potential into the future, and really giving them a good understanding of what the opportunities are today, and as well as helping them to understand what the significant amount of challenges are that the industry is currently working towards finding solutions for. And I think just looking at the feedback that we had from those conversations, it was really just planting the seed. And I think safety was a big topic that we got a lot of feedback on, of just how, we're having a conversation about mixing electricity and water, and a lot of curiosity of what's driving this innovation. I think if you look at the marine industry, we're pretty different from auto in that this is not, being impressed on us by regulation, and that it truly has been an industry driven transition. and the investment as well. And that's something that we want to continue. And I think across the board, a lot of these lawmakers were in committee staff they were expressed a lot of eagerness to continue working with our industry moving forward. And so we are going to continue to carry these conversations forward and make sure that we're at the table educating these policymakers and working with them on potential ways to incorporate policy into legislation that is going to help spur innovation within our industry and support the adoption as well. And lastly, I'm going to touch on the Next Generation Policy Working Group that NMMA is standing up. Actually, this week we're having our first meeting. The purpose of this group is to bring together the industry to work through all of the different challenges and variables that are impacting this innovation, looking at battery technology innovation, developing a carbon neutral liquid biofuel, also looking at other alternative renewable propulsion system technologies, the issue with the price gap and cost parity, and what are some solutions to help address that, potential new workforce needs that are coming up because we're having more of these tech focused jobs in developing this battery technology, looking at the supply chain issues and how is our industry going to be able to compete and have access to these materials. And then also more downstream issues such as, how are we going to be replacing conservation funding and those important revenue streams, which today a lot of conservation funding is that main revenue stream is motorboat fuel taxes. And so as we're kind of putting the industry on course to have, be transitioning to electric, we need to make sure that we're at the same time looking at ways to be able to replace, where we're driving that revenue from, because conservation it will continue to remain to be a key priority for the industry. And so what the working group is going to be doing is, as a part of working through all of those factors that are impacting this space, we're going to be putting together a robust policy agenda that we'll be able to take to Capitol Hill in January of next year when the new Congress comes in, to continue that process of educating them on what's feasible right now and what is an incentive and investment structure look like to help our industry to continue this investment in these innovations. And then the other main objective here with the working group is to look at we're having the main focus on developing domestic policy, but there's also going to be a very real need to make sure that we are coordinating with our international stakeholders and harmonizing what our messaging is and what it's going to take to need to see broader adoption, and looking at needing to standardize charging infrastructure, as well as the safety education campaign, but first and foremost also making sure that we're talking about these technologies and this transition in a way that is very fixed on securing a market-driven approach and transition towards making these products and then selling them and getting them out in the marketplace as well. So with that, that concludes the presentations for today. So we will go ahead and move over to the question and answer segment. We had a number of questions submitted ahead of time, so I'll go ahead and go to those. And please, if you do have a question, please feel free to submit those through the Q&A portal, and we will try to get through as many as we can. Jeff, I'm going to go over to you first. Here's a question. I hear a lot about charging cars and how much better electric vehicles are for CO2 emissions, but what about when you charge them from a coal-fired power plant? Doesn't that negate any environmental benefits?
All right, great question. Sorry, I had some technical issues with my computer. I switched my phone. It's a great question. The CO2 emissions, even though you may be charging from a coal-fired power plant, they're pretty efficient. You have to remember that internal combustion engines, particularly cars, are not very efficient when they're operating on gasoline. It's typically like 15% thermally efficient by the time everything is factored in. So even if you were to charge a car off a coal-fired power plant, you'll still be out a little bit ahead relative to where you would be from internal combustion. So, but good question nonetheless.
Thank you. Scott, here's one for you. If I comply with E30, does this ensure my product is compliant, or are there additional standards I need to consider?
Yeah, great question. So E30 only covers electric propulsion systems. It does reference additional ABYC standards such as E10 battery installation, E30 AC and DC electrical. So what the manufacturer will have to do is review each individual standard published by ABYC, read through the scope of that standard to see if it applies to your product.
Daniel, last week, the Fed stepped up its aggressiveness in fighting inflation. Did this change your group's forecast for growth in unemployment?
It will. We have not done our July forecast yet. We'll do that in about a week and a half. The Fed's latest projection now on unemployment by the end of 2024 is 4.1%. Our previous one was 3.7%. I would guess that we will be raising that at least to what the Fed has. I still believe that that's a little low. I believe I mentioned I would guess probably closer to 4.5% to 5% by the end of 2024. And growth, our updated growth forecast is probably going to be reflective of conditions that, if you didn't have any context, you might suggest they look like recession conditions. So slower growth in the next couple of years and more elevated unemployment. Not really high, but higher than what we have, yes.
Okay. Let's see. Jeff, can you tell us, do hydrofoils show promise in improving CO2 emissions?
Absolutely. The hydrofoils certainly have an impact in the ability to make moving a lot more weight in the boat a lot easier. That you have to remember, though, depending upon the type of hydrofoil that's used, automotive has really essentially kept the vehicles the same. We could have reduced CO2 emissions by just having everyone drive a smaller car or switch to a scooter, but we kept the vehicles fundamentally the same. And whether or not consumers would accept a fundamentally different boat is yet to be determined. I think there's a lot of promise in being able to improve the hydrodynamics of a boat. Like I said, for years and years, we just simply threw a lot more power at a boat to make it perform better. But getting the boat to more easily plane right on top of the water, whether that's through hydrofoils or just through better analysis or computational fluid dynamics or whatever we're going to need to do, will certainly make an impact and make it more feasible for electrification moving forward. So, good question.
Scott, here's another one for you. What's the best way to stay up to date with any changes to these evolving and maturing standards around electrification?
Right. So we know this is a fast evolving technology. And one way to stay abreast of what's going on in regards to certification and safety is kind of a shameless plug for NMMA. We do produce a bulletin, compliance bulletin that goes out monthly that covers all those issues, as well as NMMA Current. So if you have any interest in staying up to date on those items and you're not subscribed to those those bulletins, please let myself or Callie know, and we'll get you registered.
Scott, here's one more for you. Does the NMMA have plans to offer a certification process based on ABYC standards for EV propulsion systems and EV optimized hulls?
So on the EV propulsion system, yes. The BYCC recently approved the E30 electric propulsion system standard for adoption into the NMMA certification program, beginning with the 2023 model year. So the 2023 model year actually began on June 1st, 2022. So we will be inspecting manufacturers' products to that particular standard.
Okay. Jeff, do you ever see an electric vessel utilizing 800 horsepower for 10 hours a day, every day?
Depends on what the vessel is. If it's a large displacement vessel that is, let's say a ferry, or it's used at a very specific test cycle or usage cycle, I should say. It's possible, but it really depends on the application and the type of boat. I think, if you're looking at a recreational boat, 10 hours of use, you could probably idle for 10 hours, or you could, do slow speed for 10 hours. But if you want to go, on plane at maximum speed for a certain period of time, that's where it gets challenging. So very, very dependent on the type of usage profile of that particular vessel.
One more for you, Jeff. How likely is it that the battery will need to be replaced prior to the 10-year time frame used for greenhouse gas reduction calculations?
A lot of variables in that question. If you look at what's happening in automotive, there's certainly been battery replacements that have happened in the automotive industry, and it's still very early. We're not 10, 15 years out to really see how these systems are gonna play out over time. I think generally the marine environment is a lot more harsh. You've got saltwater environments, a lot of corrosion. Impact loading is a lot different on a recreational boat. That needs to be considered as well. Certainly on automotive, you're going to have a smoother, more controlled environment, perhaps. So a lot of it's yet to be determined, and it depends on also how often you're charging it. If you're just leaving your battery at 50% and it's in the water, it's not really having any temperature extremes, storage extremes. It'll probably last a long time. But as you get into environments where, let's say, you put your boat at the upper level of a hotel or storage facility, and it sits there in Texas at 130 degrees in the summertime, that's going to have an impact in that battery life. So a lot of it's yet to be determined. I would say generally, marine environment is going to be a bit more harsh than automotive in many ways. So.
Daniel, you mentioned that high oil prices and the expectation that they will remain high going forward are helping to increase demand for electric vehicles. Aren't prices high enough now to incentivize the oil industry to increase production, which would then bring the oil prices back down?
So in the past, that has been true. There has traditionally been a very strong relationship between price and exploration, and then coming from exploration, increased production and supply, which brings the price down. That relationship between price and exploration over the last couple of years has been pretty much broken. And that's a result of a number of things. Probably the most significant would be hostile policy and rhetoric from a significant part of Washington, D.C. So I wouldn't expect any significant movements from American oil that will drastically increase the supply and bring the price down. What is possible, however, is if high oil prices continue to incentivize further adoption of electric vehicles and more investment in electric, Saudi Arabia could increase their production simply, in America, American energy companies have been and will continue to kind of transition and invest more in gas as opposed to in electric as opposed to oil and gas as consumer preferences move that way. Saudi Arabia really only has one resource, and they would rather sell that resource at a lower price than not sell it at all. So that is a possibility going forward and something to keep an eye on.
Okay. We've got time for one last question, and Scott or Jeff, I'll pose this to either of you, whoever wants to answer. Are these lithium batteries dangerous on the water at all currently today?
I think the quick short answer is yes, there are some safety concerns, right? Just like with anything that's installed on a boat or car or any other appliance that we use in everyday life. And that's why ABYC has developed and moved the TE13 standard to the E13 standard to help protect against some of those safety hazards that we're aware of. Anything to add there, Jeff?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, industry through ABYC is working hard on trying to bring some standards to the table as far as how to deal with lithium-ion batteries in boats, and it's evolving. I mean, this is going to be the first time it's going to be published as an official standard, and that's going to continue every year to be updated and revised as we learn more and we discover more about best practices of managing batteries on boats. So yeah, ABYC has a huge role to play, as well as industry, in bringing those standards, making them meaningful. So
yeah,
All
and
right.
to tie that, sorry, Callie, and to tie that back into the previous question, I foresee NMMA going back to the BYCC and the board and seeking approval to adopt E13 now that it's an official standard. So it will become part of the NMMA certification program as well.
Thanks, Scott. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's program. As a reminder, the on-demand materials will be emailed to everyone within a few days. This email will include a link to the recording of today's presentation, as well as a survey link, and we would really appreciate you taking the time to give us your feedback. We will be having another presentation coming up in IBEX, where we'll be continuing the conversation and hope to see you there. Thank you again to all of our other panelists, Scott, Daniel, and Jeff. Really great discussion today, and thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. This webinar was brought to you by IBEX in partnership with NMMA. Thank you all and have a great day.